Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first in our series of U.S. elections webinars. The Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns works on behalf of the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, the Maryknoll Sisters, and the Maryknoll Lay Missioners to elevate the insights from the lived experiences of missioners to the seats of power where change can be made. Through the month of October, on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be covering topics germane to the election that are significant to the Maryknoll family, including faithful stewardship of creation, debt relief, and immigration. Today's webinar is titled Peace, War, and Human Rights, with our Senior Program Officer for Peace and Nonviolence, Dan Moriarty. Dan Moriarty served as a Maryknoll lay missioner in Bolivia, working with Aymara youth and as the national coordinator for prison ministry. After 6 years as a social justice minister in campus ministry in Seattle University, he returned to Bolivia to start and run a volunteer and immersion program with Maryknoll. He taught graduate courses in conflict transformation at the Universidad Mayor de San Simón, and he gave lectures and presentations on nonviolence, conflict transformation, human rights, mission, and Bolivian politics and history to various university and nonprofit groups. He has a master's in international peace studies from the Kroc Institute of the University of Notre Dame, and the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns was lucky to enlist Dan in 2019, and he has been working on peace and nonviolence issues for us ever since. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me just share my screen. There we go. And I'll turn off my video. So you can see there. Thank you, Thomas. And it's exciting to be starting this series of webinars. As you mentioned, this is the first in a series. And throughout the series, as we look at the different issues that we'll be covering, what we won't be doing is comparing candidates side by side. First of all, we would be prohibited from doing that by U.S. tax code as a nonprofit, and also there are others who can do that better. What we hope to do here is to think about the election on our own terms in the light of Catholic social teaching and from a mission perspective, informed by our experiences, the experiences of Maryknoll missioners in communities around the globe where they live and work. And we'll be focusing on global concerns, foreign policy issues, global affairs, and issues that span borders. Today's topic, peace, war, and human rights, is typical of many of these issues in that if we were to do a side-by-side comparison, neither party's platform really reflects Catholic social teaching or gospel values quite the way we would hope it would. U.S. policy and activity around the world often falls short of the church's vision, which is God's reign. But this doesn't mean we can adopt a kind of pox on both our houses approach and wash our hands of politics and of these elections. Quite the contrary. So, as this is our first webinar in the series, the first issue that we would like to address is elections themselves. We're called to engage in civil society as people of faith, and to engage with our government to promote policies that better reflect our vision and values. And this starts, but does not end, with voting. Surely, whoever wins this election, there will be opportunities to appeal for better policy and the need for us to resist bad policy. And Maryknoll has been here in Washington, D.C. for many years doing just this, through White House administrations and Congresses led by both major parties. And Pope Francis spoke about this recently, reminding us that even when both major party candidates espouse positions that are different from the church's, that may fail to protect life in every instance, we must discern and do what we can to support the best or least bad outcome And in consulting our conscience, we must recognize that not voting wouldn't let us off the hook. It would really just make us that much more responsible for whichever government is ultimately elected to represent us. So Francis tells us you have to vote and you have to choose the lesser evil. And we should also take into consideration the realities surrounding how we practice these rights and responsibilities to vote. And so I would highlight two things here. First, Catholic social teaching and the Sermon on the Mount actually call us always to listen to the least of these, the meek, the poor, and the oppressed, any group that's marginalized. And we're called to build communities and recognize each other's rights and dignity. And this means, in the case of elections, that we must seek always to include these other groups in voting. We must resist any attempt to reduce the number of people or the communities who can participate in our elections, or to silence the voices of any voters in our country. And the other concern is political violence around elections. The US bishops had a statement on this recently and have been very clear. There's a real threat of violence in our elections today. We saw devastating examples of this 4 years ago. Political divisions in the country have been aggravated and whipped up to a fever pitch, and we cannot ignore this threat. So we need to respond to both of these threats, attempts to suppress the vote and political violence related to elections. And one way we can do this is by voting early and helping others to do the same. Now, this works differently in different states, but find out how it works where you live, because when we vote early and help others to do so, we help avoid any attempt to intimidate, turn away, or otherwise exclude voters on election day. And we also help ensure a clear outcome to the election, which will reduce the risk of false claims of fraud that lead to violence. We as Maryknoll also are very aware of the unique power US voters have around the world. As an economic, political, and military superpower, our politics here in the United States have impacts far beyond our shores. Indeed, we may convince ourselves that politics don't ultimately have much to do with our daily lives, but who we elect here in the US can literally mean life or death for millions of people around the world who have no vote here. We are US citizens, but we're children of God first, and as such, we must consider how our vote will impact our siblings around the world who have no say in US policies that affect their lives. And this brings us to a document that I'll be referring to throughout the presentation today, the papal encyclical by Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, Brotherly and Sisterly Love and Social Friendship. This encyclical really provides a number of touchstones for us when we're thinking about the issues of peace, war, and human rights. And there are a few ways I think we can describe this important church document. One, in many ways, it's an encyclical that describes nonviolence without ever actually using the word nonviolence, and talks a lot about seeking peace with justice and the ways we can do that. It's also kind of a summary of all of Catholic social teaching, which ties it all up with a couple of concepts we'll talk about that are central to the teachings of both Pope Francis and his inspiration, both of his name and in this encyclical, St. Francis of Assisi. And here it's also kind of a companion piece to Francis's previous encyclical, Laudato Si. Laudato Si focused on care for the environment, our common home, but it emphasized the idea that care for creation is inextricably tied to economic justice and justice for the poor and to peace building. If we see these three areas as kind of legs on the tripod of Catholic social teaching, and Laudato Si looked at the whole tripod, but from the perspective of care for the environment, then Fratelli Tutti looks at the same tripod from the perspective of social justice for the poor and marginalized, reminding us that we are all sisters and brothers and need to care for one another. And again, Francis reminds us that we cannot separate these three parts. When he does talk about peace in Fratelli Tutti, he describes the kinds of issues where U.S. policy tends to be so distant from the demands of the gospel and the vision of the church. For example, here and elsewhere, he rejects the very notion of a just war that has guided so much of our thinking about foreign policy. He points instead to ways that modern military technologies inevitably result in massive destruction of innocent lives, civilians, and of the environment, and indeed pose an existential threat to humanity. So often on these issues of war and peace and human rights, we find ourselves a kind of voice in the wilderness, uh, and we're calling for positions and policies that no major politician in the United States tends to support, sadly. Some of these issues include the ongoing war in Gaza, in Israel-Palestine, where we have been advocating for a ceasefire for almost a year now to no avail, although we have convinced a lot of people in the White House, not the president, but other people, and a significant number of legislators to join us in that call. Iran, too, we've been working through 2 administrations to try to salvage and bring back the nuclear accord with Iran. And that hasn't happened. And now, as we see today, with war expanding from Israel, Palestine to Lebanon, and now Iran, the fact that we have no ongoing dialogue with Iran on these issues and that they're closer than ever to having nuclear weapons just makes the whole situation that much more dangerous. We've also been advocating for peace with justice in Russia and Ukraine, not ignoring the injustice of one country invading another, but also looking at the root causes of this, including threats from NATO, and looking for ways that Ukrainians can have peace with justice. We've been advocating for an end to the ongoing war and genocide in Sudan, and the United States, while not getting directly involved, has continued to support other countries who are involved and using that as a kind of a proxy war because of mining interests there. In Haiti, the United States has been proposing and financing an armed international force led by Kenyans, where we have been calling for the United States to stop the flow of guns and ammunition to the country that are fueling the gang violence and are mainly coming from the United States. If the US could stop the flow of guns from our shores to theirs, it would end the violence and allow Haitians to build democracy. There are bigger ongoing issues that kind of span many of these different places. Pentagon spending in general, depending on what you include in defense spending, it is always recognized as close now to $1 trillion a year. But if you include all the different armed defense elements of the budget, it's close to $1.5 trillion already. And it keeps on going up every year under presidents from both parties. Nuclear disarmament and arms control regimes are at an all-time low. There is only one remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia has currently suspended participation in it, and there is no dialogue happening right now to replace it when it expires at the beginning of 2026. That's the New START treaty. And as I mentioned, with Iran and other places, nuclear weapons continue to be a threat to life on the planet. And then prioritizing human rights. This is something we work on around the world, but so often national security interests, so-called, trump human rights issues. So one place where we've been working on this is the Philippines, where we're often told that the United States laments that the Philippines government is targeting religious and farmers and labor leaders and land defenders and threatening them and sometimes killing them, but we're going to keep on funding, training, and arming the people who are doing it because we see them as a key ally against China. And in one point, we actually asked people at the State Department, what does it mean then when you say you're going to prioritize human rights? And we were told, prioritize, we don't mean put them ahead of those other national security interests, but just value them when they coincide with those other interests. And it was tempting and difficult not to actually pull out a dictionary and explain to them what the word priority and prioritize means. But this is a frustration that we've, again, faced with different administrations. And we have similar issues in Guatemala, trying to sanction leaders there who have violated human rights and undermined democracy. We just had a friend who we met here in Washington a few years ago. Jose Lopez was murdered in Honduras, and a Marine lay missioner has gone to meet with people who are addressing the issue there. In El Salvador and Peru, we've been trying to get the United States to stop supporting human rights abusers, and also in Tanzania, where the government is taking away land from Maasai people. There's a delegation we've been working with in Washington just this week. These are all issues where it can seem like both parties, whoever's in power, our pleas tend to fall on deaf ears. So how can we think about elections in terms of all of these issues where we experience so much frustration and heartache and see violence continuing? How can we evaluate the people we vote for? One thing that's important as we continue to advocate, we'll keep advocating on these issues no matter who's in power, but it really matters who that is, because it matters who will talk to us, who will listen to our pleas to the faith community, to grassroots groups, and to voices from these countries where we foment violence. And who do the candidates bring with them into government? Are these people who understand the issues, who will talk to us, and who share our end goals of sustainable peace, even if they don't maybe always see eye to eye with us about how to achieve it? Also, think about down ballot voting. There's a lot of talk about the presidential election, but we do often see progress on these issues in Congress and with individual members of Congress who can be key later in introducing and supporting legislation that can help us move towards these goals. So don't think only about the presidential election, but also down ballot, who you're sending to Washington, and even who you're backing in your local elections. For example, there's a campaign called Back from the Brink that works to get local governments, city councils, state and county and local governments to sign on to 5 principles that would help to make the planet safer from nuclear war. And this is a way of showing national politicians, Congress and the White House, that there is real support for and interest in advancing these issues so that we might start to get more progress at the national level. So voting for the president, thinking about who's open to talk about these things and who are they going to bring into into office with them, advisors, etc. Who are you voting for Congress, and who are you voting for even locally, can help us to move toward the goal of sustainable, just peace. So coming back to Fratelli Tutti, another big part of how we can think about candidates and the elections is simply thinking about who shares this vision of sisterly and brotherly love and social friendship. Social friendship is a strange phrase that works better in Spanish. But what it means by social is taking the concept of neighbor and friend, like you see in the picture of from the Good Samaritan. The concept of friendship and being neighborly and extending it to these more complicated international relationships, whether they're economic relationships or relationships between states, and thinking about what that means in terms of things like international policy. So when we focus on brotherly and sisterly love and social friendship, what does that mean for these tough issues? Um, First of all, we think beyond just the wars that are happening now to what kind of creates the conditions for war or for peace. So remember that tripod that I talked about earlier: peace, social and economic justice, and care for our common home, which are all integrally connected. This idea of integration is huge for Pope Francis, integrating these different elements of Catholic social teaching. And so we can also think of these in terms of words that he likes to use: integral ecology, meaning connected to peace and social justice; integral human development, meaning economic and development, but also that's tied to people's place in creation and caring for the earth; and peace. And that's why I propose another word with integral in it: integral security, which is a different model of thinking about human security rather than the armed defense and national security model that is currently dictating so much of our policy. All of this really amounts to what we mean when we talk about gospel nonviolence. Nonviolence is a way of interrupting and preventing, interrupting, and healing from violence. And so it's a way of achieving the kind of peace that we seek. And that's peace that is positive, meaning not just the absence of war, but the conditions for harmonious relationships. It's just, it addresses the root causes of conflict, and it's sustainable, including because it has ongoing dynamic relationships between the parties. It seeks healing, and it also seeks a just and positive relationship with the earth. So that model of national security, we see it also when we talk about things like budgets, and this is something where who you vote for Congress also matters a lot. Because when we talk about national security, we tend to think of military and defense, homeland security, border protection, and they get most of the money. Like I said, over $1 trillion. But diplomacy gets a lot less than $10 million. Global and public health, international aid and development, environmental protection, these are things that never even tend to enter into security conversations. But as we've seen with the COVID pandemic and with climate change, they threaten our security in unimaginable ways. They can pose an existential threat to our security. And so we need to change the way we think about security. Going back to Fratelli Tutti and this image of, positive peace, we also can sorry, I meant to mention, we'll have another webinar on some of these issues like climate coming up. So I won't go too far into that, but it has to be considered as part of how we achieve peace. And some other areas where we can look at candidates and see real differences is in their approach to multilateralism. This is key to developing this kind of positive, just, and sustainable peace. Multilateralism, building relationships with other countries, and we'll talk more about that. Peace building, doing things like pursuing integral human development, and then addressing the root causes of conflicts, so that we're not just stopping the violence momentarily, but we're actually building new relationships that will avoid violence in the future. So what are some of the ways we do these? One is our approach to the United Nations when we talk about multilateralism. And the United Nations itself has introduced this concept of human security. And there's a lot of talk at the United Nations about human security as including all of the kinds of things we've been talking about. But it's important to notice that the United Nations is not a monolith. And while many of the agencies work for this vision of human security, the Security Council, which is the most powerful body at the United Nations, is still focused on competing visions of national security. And so the United Nations can be a challenging place to work. And so I don't mean to say that supporting the United Nations alone is the answer. We also have to seek to support it specifically in ways that pursue human security. That includes human development, care for creation, etc. The United Nations, one way they do this is by the Sustainable Peace Agenda, which includes the Sustainable Development Goals. These are goals that address poverty, hunger, the environment, all kinds of areas. It really is an integral approach, and they're very clear about the connection between these issues and peace. As Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, inclusive and sustainable development not only is an end in itself, but also happens to be the best defense against the risk of violent conflict. So when we talk about social friendship, we talk about multilateralism, peace building, and root causes, we have to remember that our votes here and the people we elect impact the ability to pursue these at a global level and impact lives around the world. So some other examples of how we've been working on this and things you need to look for in candidates' speeches and platforms and ask their campaigns what they support is international cooperation on the climate, commitment to the Paris Accords and strengthening those, participation in the COP COP process, which is the Conference of Parties on the UN Framework for the Convention on Climate Change. COP is a lot easier to say. That's the ongoing talks, global talks on climate change, and then supporting things like climate finance that also addresses this idea of justice for the poor, impoverished countries who cannot pay for the necessary mitigation of the effects of climate change. The countries that have caused climate change need to contribute to that. So where do the candidates stand on that? Again, where do they stand on negotiating for the control and ultimately disarmament around nuclear weapons? Support and reform of the UN, looking at how we can make the Security Council more accountable to this broader vision of security and more functional to stop wars like the ones we've been seeing increasingly around the world. Also, countering authoritarianism, which stifles the voices of marginalized communities and countries around the world. So what are we doing to promote more open and democratic governments that listen to those communities, or would candidates be bolstering and strengthening authoritarian leaders around the world because of economic interests, national security interests, etc.? And more generally, listen to the language, because again, we're looking for candidates we can work with. We'll continue to advocate, we'll continue to reach out and try to influence policy, and we can only do that with people who are at least able to understand our vision here. So do they use language that reflects this idea of a global community of siblings? And that vision needs to include our place in creation, our non-human siblings, our relationship with the earth and with our common home. And are they attentive to these marginalized communities, impoverished peoples, but also the role of women in peace building? Peace is always more sustainable and more successful when women are at the fore in peace processes. Do they listen to indigenous people? I mentioned the Maasai earlier, indigenous communities who are so often excluded from national conversations that impact their futures directly. Do they listen to youth and seek processes that include youth, which also leads to more sustainable peace where there's been conflict? So listening to the language and the general vision of our leaders, even if they're not where we would like them to be on every issue, will result in leadership that moves us closer to these goals. So discern which candidates allow us to move closer to this vision of integral security, peace, together with economic justice, social justice, and care for our common home. And get involved, especially with congressional candidates. Contact their campaigns, find out where they stand, ask them where they stand at public events if you can go, and get policy commitments from them. Get them on the record. Ask them to promise, because this is a time where they listen to voters and they want to please voters, but then you can use that later to say, in the campaign, you promised you would do this. What are you doing? This is the time to take steps on this issue. So express your concerns, explain where your concerns come from, why this is so important to you, and get them on the record, making commitments to move us toward just and sustainable peace. So again, I encourage you to vote for integral security and just peace. And surely after January 20th and the inauguration, we will continue to see you in the streets. That's my prepared remarks. So we have any
Thank you so much,
questions?
Stan, for it's a very comprehensive presentation, very high level. I want to get us started with Q&As. So feel free if any of the participants, you can enter your questions in the Q&A box right at the bottom of your screen. But in the meantime, I'll kick it off with a couple questions. I think it's very interesting that you started and ended your presentation talking about participation, because I think we know that voting is very important, but it's not the only thing. But I think we might find among other Catholics questions about do we really need to vote in order to be participating, and what does that mean for Catholics to be participating in a democracy where things are messy and we are choosing between the lesser of two evils? And one person who comes to mind is Dorothy Day, who famously would not vote. So I wonder what message you would tell to the people listening, or suggest to them as they're having conversations with other people who are wondering whether or not they should vote, about the making that decision.
Thanks. Yeah, that's important. I think I've heard some Catholic voices argue that democracy in itself is not something that the Catholic Church necessarily universally embraces. I think that's not completely accurate, or it's a distortion in as much as historically it wasn't always, but it has been in recent times, and I don't mean very recent, I mean for quite a while. And it's also it's based ultimately on the notion that democracy in and of itself does not bring around the reign of God. Often people can vote for policies that are contrary to church teachings, and so we ultimately must be faithful to church teachings. But that is a reason to vote again for the people who best reflect our vision, but then also to be engaged beyond voting with trying to get them always to better reflect that. And so, but at the same time, there are plenty of church documents that talk about the importance of democracy as the best system of government for allowing participation and allowing people to have a voice in the decisions that impact their lives. Subsidiarity is a central value of Catholic social teaching, and representative democracy is one of the best ways when we protect it and make sure it works robustly and in a way that's responsive to the voters. It's one of the best ways to ensure that. And as far as Dorothy Day, she didn't vote, as kind of a way of not participating in a government system that allowed for war and other immoral things. But she went to jail for the right of women to vote. She demonstrated for the rights of African Americans to have access to the ballot. She was passionate about the right of everybody to vote, and she was engaged in civics in various ways to such a degree that she's now being considered for sainthood, on the path to sainthood. And so I would say if anybody is taking Dorothy Day's example to not vote, then I would challenge them first to be at least as engaged as she was in other ways, as a journalist writing about these issues, as the leader of a movement that serves the poor and migrants and others, and does that work of serving our sisters and brothers, and as somebody who is constantly engaged in protest movements and advocacy in other ways. So if somebody's doing all the things Dorothy Day did and then also doesn't vote, that we can agree to disagree. But I think it's an important way for us to pursue, together with all those other activities, our vision for living out our deepest values.
Another thing, and this maybe comes a little bit from an inside knowledge working with you, is that I know even on the national stage, and when you've met with members of Congress or with people in the State Department, there's often a question of why prioritize human rights when national security is more important, or where they put those two at odds, and they say that well, we can't go after, for instance, the environmentalists who were killed in Honduras that you mentioned, because national security takes priority, or what you mentioned with the Philippines about enforcing human rights there, or trying to hold our ally more accountable.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. First of all, I think that's often a misconception on the part of many political leaders. If we do respect human rights, we create the conditions for peace, which makes us more secure. I think we can't separate the two and pit them against one another. The protection of human rights is part of what makes countries and societies resilient to violent conflict. And so I think that dichotomy is born of a misunderstanding of that reality, but also of other interests. You gave the Philippines example. First of all, the arms, the kinds of arms and training and units that are being used to target nuns and religious and labor leaders and land defenders in the Philippines are not the same things that are going to defend the Philippines from Chinese military incursions into their waters. They're not the same thing. So sometimes it's a little bit of a red herring. And I think we talk about that. For example, we use the human rights situation in China as a reason to escalate tensions with China. And then we use it as an excuse not to address human rights concerns elsewhere in the region. But we also don't actually, by doing that, improve the human rights situation in China. We do that more by engaging in positive ways with China. So I think that's both fails to take into consideration the way human rights contribute to peace and cannot be separated from peace building, and which is ultimately security, making us more secure. And also we need to look at what the real motivations are in many of those cases. There's also a lot of economic motive, because in many places we're talking about supplying arms and things to countries that the arms manufacturers and dealers are keenly interested in continuing to do.
And you mentioned escalation. I think on a lot of our minds, we're worried about what's happened recently with the Middle East, with Iran's uh, ballistic missiles, I think. And I'm wondering, what is it that we should expect of our politicians when it comes to that situation? What is it that we want in order to see the de-escalation and peace building that would solve the issue?
Well, again, I think I should mention, I mentioned this in passing earlier, but the Marynole missionaries have a great way of conceiving of nonviolence and all of its different elements. And they break it down really simply. It's preventing violence, interrupting or intervening in violence, and then healing from violence, seeking reconciliation and uh, building peace. And so I think that helps us to think about this kind of nonviolent approach to violent conflict, always seeking to reduce the violence. And so often we think that we can achieve peace through violence. Um, and so we continue to arm Israel. We continue to seek peace through nuclear deterrence, but we've broken off talks with Iran. Um, I think it's a whole array of things. I mentioned those two areas. If we would support a ceasefire and stop arming Israel, there's no doubt that what Israel has been doing in Gaza has provoked responses from other neighbors, from Hezbollah in Lebanon and from their sponsors in Iran. Um, and so they have other interests. Uh, there will still be other issues to address there. But if we started by having a ceasefire and creating kind of the conditions for a ceasefire by stopping our arming and funding of the war in Gaza, then it would be much easier to talk to these other groups. And if we had been able to salvage the nuclear deal, which President Obama brokered with Iran, which was working, but President Trump pulled us out of that deal. And since then, Iran has been advancing toward having nuclear weapons. Not only would they be less dangerous and not so close to becoming a nuclear power, but because of that, we would have an ongoing inspections regime, ongoing dialogue, and it would be much easier to address the escalation that's happening now if we were engaged in that kind of a positive relationship with them.
All right. And another thing, I know perhaps some of the people on this call have watched last night. There was a debate between the vice presidential candidates, and a theme that came up in regards to national security and peace and safety was the idea of deterrence through strength, which might be partly rhetoric. But I am interested in what your response is to that kind of language that safety can be assured by seeming very tough and being potentially very aggressive.
Yeah. There's so much to say about that concept of strength through deterrence, which ultimately deterrence always sounds nice, like that's achieving peace. But what deterrence means is threat. It means threatening violence so that people are afraid to act contrary to our interests because of the threat of violence that hangs over them. So we have nuclear weapons, and we say it is as a deterrent of other countries using their nuclear weapons, but that's because we threaten to use ours. So deterrence and strength. This gets back to everything I was talking about integral security, women's leadership in peace processes and participation of women and youth and indigenous groups and minority groups and all, in governance, in ongoing peace processes and dialogues. Also, caring for our common home, caring for the environment, all of these things, addressing authoritarianism, having more participation and more democratic societies, all of these make countries more resilient to violent conflict. So economic security, for sure, economic justice. It allows individuals to participate in other ways in society, and it builds resilience. So that's real strength. Pursuing this human security is true strength. Pursuing national security through military strength, it really leads to what's called the security dilemma, which means I want to be strong, more secure through strength, so I get more weapons. And so then other countries see me doing that, so they get more weapons, ultimately making me less strong. Sounds simple and obvious, but it is what happens all the time in our foreign relations. And a good example of that is the war in Ukraine, where this is absolutely not to excuse Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They had no right to do that, and they've committed war crimes throughout that conflict. But it very well may have been avoided. There would have been a better chance, at least, for dialogue and prevention of that conflict if NATO had not been expanding toward Russia's border. NATO, which is a nuclear-armed military alliance of Western powers. And that's not a partisan statement at all. Foreign policy experts since the end of the Cold War, on the right and the left, Democrats, Republicans, people like Henry Kissinger was hardly a dove, but recognized that expanding NATO, but keeping it as a nuclear threat and military alliance, would provoke conflict with Russia, and exactly the kind of thing we're seeing now in Ukraine. So I don't believe that kind of a posture has made us stronger. We've been unable to end that war in Ukraine. We've been unable to stop Russia. And we see so many wars now popping up around the world, and we just keep on insisting that we need to be stronger and stronger by throwing more and more guns into the mix, more and more weapons, being more and more threatening, and it's not working, and it's never worked. And studies show, I mean, there is a whole world of scholarship on this, that true resilience and strength comes from pursuing this integral human security approach that we've been discussing.
Now, I'm mindful of the time, and I want to allow a chance for the participants to ask questions. So if there are any, you can enter them in the chat, right at the Q&A button at the bottom. One question that just came up: how can we tell our elected politicians that we want peace? It seems like they don't know that there are Americans who don't want more war.
Yeah, that's especially important on this issue, when we talk about choosing the lesser evil. I think every way possible would be the short answer. I think you need to write to your elected leaders. If you go to our, not to make this into a plug, but if you go to our website, Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns website, right at the top, you can sign up to receive our action alerts. And they're on different issues, but these are some of the issues. And we regularly give people opportunities to easily get informed on issues, and then write to their representatives, to the White House, to their members of Congress, their senators. And so like I said, find their campaigns and write to the campaigns and tell them this is an important issue. Why aren't you speaking more on this issue? This is something I'm thinking about as I think about my vote in November. Um, so contact the campaigns, contact your representatives' offices, write to the White House, and then when they don't listen, the last picture I had there was us in a vigil. We've been participating with Churches for Middle East Peace and other groups on the Gaza issue, and we do the same on other issues. We work in coalitions of faith leaders, and we seek meetings with the White House, with the National Security Council, with members of Congress. We write them letters, but when they don't listen, we organize vigils and protests and civil disobedience, and we work with other groups on that as well. Every way we can to let them know that we are watching and we're concerned about this and we are crying out for peace.
All right, I'm getting a tough one here. I'm gonna throw it your way, see how you do here. Um, it seems like okay, the question goes, why is the world in more turmoil today than it seems it was only 4 years ago?
That's a that is a tough one. Um, there are so many conflicts right now that we see, and each one has its own roots, its own causes, its own local roots that aren't always, in as much as we're talking about elections, they're not always um, caused by or the response, the sort of, they're not always caused by the United States. Right? There's a lot going on in the world. And so it's a complicated world, and each conflict is different. But we do have an outsized influence on the conditions that lead to conflict and also how we're able to transform conflict into peaceful, uh, kind of being waged peacefully and productively, constructively. And so it's all the things we've talked about today that our government hasn't always done. The conflict we see today in Gaza, that didn't start on October 7th. It started many years ago, and we've ignored that issue for too long. Some of our supposed uh, efforts at peace in the region we need to look in detail at what those are really about. The biggest before this conflict, some of the biggest achievements we've heard about on peace in the Middle East was what were called the Abraham Accords, series of peace accords between different Arab countries, Sudan, different countries, and Israel, Morocco, a number of Muslim majority countries with Israel, which is why they're called the Abraham Accords, because Islam and Judaism both recognize their kind of roots in Abraham. If you look at the details of those accords, those countries recognized Israel, but they haven't been able to stop the war happening in Gaza. What it did allow them to do is make more arms deals. They were really accords that opened up the way because not recognizing Israel was a barrier to being able to sell and send arms to many of those countries. And some of those same countries have been directly involved, like the United Arab Emirates. They participated in that, and now they are fighting a proxy war in Sudan, and they are supporting the group that is committing genocide in Darfur, the Rapid Support Forces. And so we really need to pay attention to how we pursue peace and what we call peace, how we understand peace. And a lot of these are long-term solutions. We have to think generationally. And that's why it's so important, even when we don't see all the policies we want right away, to just keep on ringing that bell.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. So I'm gonna go with this one. The comment from our one of our participants that our gun factories in many cities are a source of employment. So I wonder, maybe that's a question about the efficacy of or the incentives for politicians to change their positions, and whether that transformation is possible, given that it seems our employment or our current system tends to prop up weapons manufacture.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think the economics of uh, gun control and stopping arms that are being exported, that has a lot more to do with the with profit and the money that those industries pour into lobbying and congressional campaigns and presidential campaigns and things than it does to do with the jobs per se. But I think that's something we can look at the same way we're looking at transitioning away from fossil fuels and other things that provide jobs in order to have an economy that moves us towards a more sustainable and peaceful future. And so a great example of this on a big level, this isn't guns, but nuclear weapons, but read the pastoral letter from Archbishop Wester in Santa Fe on nuclear disarmament. He wrote a pastoral letter that looks at his archdiocese includes Los Alamos, a giant center of the nuclear arms industry in the United States. And he has a lot of people in Catholic churches in his archdiocese who depend on the nuclear arms industry for their livelihood and have invested their lives in this model of nuclear deterrence that has now been condemned by the Pope. And so he is really modeling a way of being pastoral about this, of seeking dialogue, of meeting with those communities and talking about how we can have an honest conversation about these moral teachings and the real moral impacts of these industries, but also the legitimate concerns of people who depend on them for their livelihood and how we can find a way forward in a way that's pastoral and inclusive.
Well, thank you again, Dan, for that. That was really well done. And thank you everyone for joining us for the first webinar in our series of webinars on US election topics. We will be following up with all who registered today with both the video recording of this webinar as well as the slides and this handy two-pager, Rethinking Security, No Justice, No Peace, which addresses some of the issues that you heard today. And these will be available on our website, maryknollogc.org. Throughout the rest of October, we'll be hosting more webinars on issues that are relevant to the Maryknoll family, faithful stewardship of creation, global debt relief, and immigration. So sign up to our email lists if you haven't already. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and be on the lookout for those as well as other elections programs. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Peace.